The Carl D. Bradley. At one point in time, this freighter was considered to be the pride of the Great Lakes, proudly sailing the waters of the Great Lakes for several decades, delivering her cargo and goods on time. But all that changed during one fateful day in 1958. On November the 18th, 1958, while sailing on what was supposed to be her last cargo run of the season, the ship encountered a storm, and then, suddenly and without warning, the vessel split nearly completely in two and sank to the bottom of Lake Michigan. There were 35 men on board the Bradley during its final voyage, and of those 35 men, only 2 would survive that terrible day. So what happened to the Carl D. Bradley that caused it to break apart and sink to the bottom of Lake Michigan? Well, that's what we're going to be exploring in today's video. I hope you enjoy. The Carl D. Bradley was a Great Lakes freighter that entered service in the year 1927. Now, at the time of her construction, she was the largest vessel operating on the Great Lakes, a title this ship would hold for the next 22 years. Now, the primary role of the Bradley was to transport limestone from the deep waters of Lake Erie, Lake Michigan, and on occasion, Lake Superior to whatever ports needed them. Now, when the Bradley first entered service, she was very successful at this task. The ship was quickly setting new records for the amount of cargo that could be transported by freighter in the Great Lakes. Everybody who sailed on board the Bradley thought that she was a magnificent vessel, and they all predicted a very bright future for the Carl D. Bradley. Now, there is one very important thing that all of you watching this video need to understand about the Great Lakes. You see, where these lakes are located so far north within the United States and Canada, the winters around these lakes can be extremely harsh. Sometimes these lakes completely freeze over during the winter months, shutting down all maritime traffic within the lakes until spring when the weather warms up. Now, this is where another crucial role for the Carl D. Bradley comes into play. You see, the Carl D. Bradley was actually used occasionally as an icebreaker ship. It was sometimes one of the very first vessels to begin sailing in the Great Lakes once the spring arrived, and this vessel would break away the ice and clear the way for smaller ships to resume their travels within the Great Lakes. Now, for the most part, the Carl D. Bradley had a pretty smooth career operating within the Great Lakes. There was the occasional incident or two, like for example in the year 1957 it was involved in a collision with a ship called the MV White Rose, and the Bradley had to go into port for extensive repairs to the hull. But yeah, besides the occasional incident, the Carl D. Bradley operated pretty well, and everybody on board the ship loved sailing aboard her. Sometimes the Carl D. Bradley was referred to as the Queen of the Lakes. That should tell you how well liked the Carl D. Bradley was by those who operated vessels in this area. Now, it should go without saying that where the Carl D. Bradley was one of the most popular vessels on the Great Lakes, it was also one of the busiest, constantly on the move from one port to the next. However, all that would change on July 1st, 1958, when the Carl D. Bradley would be laid up for 3 months due to a downturn in the steel industry. Now, it was around this time when the owners of the Carl D. Bradley decided to make an appointment for the ship to go in for extensive repairs after she was shut down for the winter months. These repairs would cost somewhere around $800,000 in 1958, so when you adjust that for inflation, that's a lot of money. But the reason why these repairs were needed was due to the fact that the several decades of sailing on the Great Lakes had taken their toll on the Bradley, and there was extensive rusting occurring to the Bradley's hull, her watertight bulkheads, her cargo holds, and so on and so forth. There was this running joke among the sailors that sailed on the Bradley who said that the ship was literally being held together by rust. They said that every time the ship encountered a storm, due to the way that the rough seas were warping and twisting the hull a bit, well, they were collecting sheared off rivets by the bucketful. So that should give you a pretty good idea as to the condition of the Bradley around this time. Now, it should be noted that an inspection was done on the Bradley a few months earlier in April of 1958, and the inspection team did see some of this damage. But ultimately, the inspection team concluded that the Bradley was in good enough condition to sail throughout the rest of the 1958 season, as long as the ship was taken in for repairs in the near future. However, unfortunately, the Carl D. Bradley would not survive long enough to get the repairs that it desperately needed. The ship ultimately met its fate on November the 18th, 1958, while bound for Rogers City, located in Michigan. Now, the day before this, the ship had just completed what was supposed to be its last cargo run of the season to a town called Gary, located in Indiana. After the ship dropped off its cargo, it set a course for, and I apologize if I mispronounce this town name, a town called Manitowoc, located in Wisconsin, where the ship was going to get the repairs that it needed and wait out the winter season. However, when the vessel was just a few hours from its destination, they received an order for the vessel to go to Rogers City to pick up one last shipment last minute. It was while the Carl D. Bradley was heading for Rogers City that the vessel ultimately met its fate. Now, around the time the Bradley set a course for Rogers City, the weather around the ship was taking a turn for the worse. You see, the winds were already blowing around the Bradley at somewhere between 25 to 35 miles per hour, and the weather forecast predicted that the wind speeds would increase drastically in the near future. There were two weather patterns merging over the Great Lakes along the course that the Bradley was due to sail, which meant that if the captain of the vessel didn't make a course change, the Bradley would soon be sailing into the path of a very lethal storm. Now, the captain of the Bradley, a man by the name of Roland Bryan, well, you see, he had this nickname among the members of the Bradley's crew. They liked to call him the heavy weather captain because he wasn't the type of man to let a storm stop him from reaching his destination. He was known to travel into storms in an attempt to reach his port of call on time. Now, here's the thing you need to understand. Despite the fact that he had this reputation, Roland did have his concerns about the storm that the Bradley was sailing into. And he was also concerned about the state of the ship itself. Before the Bradley's final voyage, he had stated that the vessel wasn't in the best condition and she should not be operating in a storm. And he was really looking forward to the repairs the ship was going to get after they retired it for the season. However, he was still determined to reach his destination with as little delay as possible. So what he did was he worked with his first and second mate on the bridge, and they plotted a course that they hoped would take them around the worst part of the storm. That way the Bradley could still reach its final destination without too much delay. Now, the course change did help out the Bradley somewhat. The ship was able to avoid the worst part of the storm. However, the storm around the ship was still slowly gathering strength. However, at this point in time, it wasn't considered that severe, and the vessel was still operating smoothly, so the captain decided to press on. Around 4 a.m., the Bradley was passing Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it was around this time that two other freighters that were operating on a similar course to the Bradley joined the ship, and all three of these vessels would sail more or less together for a time. Now, around 12 hours later, the Bradley began to pass Poverty Island, and it was around this time that the weather really took a turn for the worse. The seas were really starting to get heavy around this time, and the wind speeds around the ship had accelerated to somewhere between 60 to 65 miles per hour. However, despite these horrible conditions, the Bradley still appeared to be sailing through these rough seas pretty stably, and the ship gave no warning signs of the tragedy that was about to unfold. At 5:35 p.m., when the Bradley was around 12.5 miles or so southwest of Gull Island, suddenly and without warning, it happened. Now, when the Bradley first broke in half, initially the crew had no idea what had just happened. The only thing they knew was that they had just heard an incredibly loud bang coming from somewhere within the ship, followed by the Bradley beginning to vibrate uncontrollably. The captain of the ship, who was on the bridge at the time, decided to look aft towards the ship's stern section, and he discovered to his horror that he could see the back part of the ship sagging deeper in the water than what the front of the ship was doing. At that moment, he realized the terrible truth. The Bradley had just broken into two pieces and was beginning to sink rapidly. Now, it's important to note that the Bradley did not completely separate when she initially broke into two pieces. What had happened was the bottom parts of the vessel separated. However, the ship did remain connected at the top for a time. Now, the first thing the captain did when he saw the ship breaking up was he ordered the engines to stop, and he set off an alarm that told all of the crew to abandon ship. He then ordered one of the crewmen on the bridge to begin sending out a distress signal to let all the other ships in the area know that the Bradley was in trouble. This crewman was successful in sending out the distress signal. However, a few moments later, all of the power in the ship's bridge died. You see, what had happened was the power lines that connected the front of the ship to the engines in the back of the ship, well, they just got severed by the vessel breaking in two. Once all power in the bridge was lost, the only thing the crew on the bridge could do was try to get on their life jackets and evacuate the Bradley as quickly as possible. Now, the Bradley had 2 lifeboats on board and 1 life raft that the crew could use to evacuate the sinking ship. The 2 lifeboats were stored at the very back of the Bradley, while the life raft was stored at the front of the ship. Now, it's important to note that this life raft, it wasn't the type of one that would have to be inflated or whatever before the crew could use it. It was already assembled and ready to go. But it was specially designed that no matter which way this life raft landed in the water, it would always be right side up. Now, I don't mean that it would automatically, flip itself over if it landed upside down. What I mean is that the top of the life raft and the bottom of the life raft, well, they were built the exact same way, meaning that no matter which way this life raft landed in the water, it would be just as easy for the crew members that were trying to use it to cling to it and escape the Bradley. Now, the life raft was thrown overboard shortly before the Bradley's bow section slipped beneath the surface. However, the same can't be said for the 2 lifeboats. You see, the Bradley sank by the head, and then once the bow slipped beneath the surface, it began to pull the stern vertically up into the air. Now, the crew did try to launch the 2 lifeboats that were stored on the stern section of the ship. However, one of the lifeboats became entangled in the cable securing it to the ship, making it impossible to launch. The other lifeboat, well, when they tried to lower it over the ship's side, the way that the Bradley was sinking, well, it caused the lifeboat to swing out so far from the ship that it made boarding this lifeboat impossible. So that means that the only boat to successfully get away from the Bradley before it sank was the life raft. The other 2 lifeboats on the ship would go down with the Bradley. Now, while all of this was going on board the Bradley, there was another freighter in the area called the Christian Satori. This ship was somewhere between 4 or 5 miles, give or take, from the Bradley. They had picked up the Bradley's distress call, and they could see the Bradley sinking from where they were. This ship immediately changed course and was heading towards the Bradley's position, and the crewmen that were on board that ship were watching the Bradley sink through their binoculars. They said that they saw the lights go out at the front part of the ship, but they also said that they saw the lights remain on in the back part of the ship for a time. This was because even though the power lines connecting the engines of the Bradley to the front of the ship were severed, the engines were still running, so the back part of the ship's lights remained on briefly. They said that they then saw the Bradley's stern go nearly completely vertical into the air, and then just before the ship sank, they saw the lights in the stern go out, and then they also said they saw this massive flash of yellow light come from the Bradley. They conclude that something on board the Bradley must have caught fire during the ship's final moments and exploded. Then, at 5:50 p.m., roughly 15 minutes or so after the Bradley first broke into 2 pieces, the Bradley sank to the bottom of Lake Michigan. Now, the life raft that was thrown from the front of the Bradley shortly before the ship sank, well, 4 crewmen from the Bradley managed to reach this life raft shortly before the ship went down. However, the nightmare for these 4 crewmen that reached this life raft was far from over. You see, one thing I haven't really touched on in this video so far was just how cold it was around the Bradley while the ship was sinking. It was absolutely freezing. Some of the crewmen who would later survive this horrible disaster said that the water was actually warmer than the air above them. They said that the wind felt like knives stabbing them as they were clinging to this life raft for dear survival. And to make matters worse, the storm was only getting worse. The waves were getting bigger, the wind was blowing more strongly. I mean, I can't imagine a more horrible situation to be in. Now, the men on this life raft could see the Christian Satori trying to reach them, so they had a little bit of hope that they would soon be rescued. But as the storm continued to get worse, the Christian Satori had no choice but to turn around and take shelter in a nearby port until conditions improved. So that meant that the poor crewmen that were on this life raft, well, they could do nothing but just simply stay there and watch as the ship that they thought would rescue them turned around and disappeared into the night. Around 5 hours after the Bradley sank, the Coast Guard attempted to launch a small 36-foot motorized lifeboat into Lake Michigan to attempt to reach the area where the vessel sank to look for survivors. However, the storm was still raging so badly and the waves were so large that this small lifeboat was literally being tossed around in the lake like a rag doll. The crew in this boat had no choice but to turn around and head back to land until conditions improved. It wouldn't be until around 15 hours after the Bradley sank before a vessel called the Sundew managed to locate the life raft from the Bradley and pick up the survivors that were on board. However, where so much time had passed, 2 out of the 4 crewmen that were on this life raft had been lost to Lake Michigan. They had most likely been thrown off of the raft at some point during the massive storm the night before, and they were just gone, never to be seen again. There were still 2 crewmen clinging to the life raft alive, and they were brought aboard the Sundew. However, one of the crewmen on the Sundew noticed that due to how cold it was the night before, these 2 men from the Bradley literally had ice forming on their skin. That's how cold it was. Now, over the course of the next day, they continued to look for survivors from the Bradley. They found around 17 bodies from the Bradley, and they did in fact find one more crewman who was still alive from the Bradley, floating in the water. He had been kept up by his life jacket. They did bring this man aboard. However, unfortunately, he did die soon after his recovery. All in all, there were only 2 survivors from the Bradley out of a crew of 35. Okay, so now that all of you watching this video now know the story of the Carl D. Bradley, let's now try to answer the ultimate question of this video. Why did the Carl D. Bradley break apart and sink in that storm? Well, there is considerable debate on this topic. Some people try to blame the captain for taking the ship out into that storm in the first place. And while I do see where they're coming from, this captain, he probably thought at the time that he would be able to get around that storm. And there were other freighters operating in the lakes at the time, so even though he did know that his vessel wasn't in the best shape, he probably thought he could work around it. That's at least my logic at the time. He doesn't strike me as somebody who is careless, but ultimately, I think what happened was, due to the weakened state the ship's hull and structure was under at the time that she went into that storm, I think that while under normal circumstances, the Bradley could have handled that storm no problem, in her weakened state, I think the ship just suffered a massive structural failure. And this is what caused the Carl D. Bradley to sink on that cold night so long ago. But yeah, guys, now all of you watching this video now know the story of the Carl D. Bradley, one of the worst shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it a like. If you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much. It really helps out a lot, and I'll see you all in the next one. Y'all take care. Special thanks to David McGee and the Blue Star Line for providing all of the incredible animations of the Carl D. Bradley you saw in today's video. Please check out his work in the description below. Special thanks to my captain level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.